Now let's get a little more specific with DNS, and let's talk about how Active Directory and DNS work together. So one of the things, first of all, let's start off with a simple statement. DNS is required for Active Directory to function. And if you remember, when we installed Active Directory, it checked to see if there was a DNS server and asked us the question, then it installed DNS for us because we didn't have a DNS server. Now we can install it manually, so you can install DNS onto the server first and then go do your Active Directory installation, whichever way you'd like to take care of that. As far as the exam is concerned, especially, you just need a good understanding of DNS, and you need to look through some of the information about DNS, some of the terminologies, and how Active Directory uses it, and some of the ways we can configure it. First of all, DNS Records, this is really just a database of all the alphanumeric names of our computers, along with the IP addresses so that it can translate them back and forth. And these are stored in a number of different files. There's actually three main types. There's a primary zone file. Now, a primary zone file means that this particular file is authoritative for the DNS records. In other words, changes are made here. This is where the final say-so is held for the records, the DNS records for that particular zone. This can be integrated with Active Directory. Now let me explain that. Usually when we create these DNS records, this is all a text file based thing. This is just created in a text file, and those records are put out there in a text file, and then they can be searched. The problem with that is that when I need that information in multiple places in my domain on different computers, I actually have to make copies of that text file, and usually I do that with secondary zones. But I can do what's called integrating the primary zone into Active Directory. Actually, I integrate DNS with Active Directory, and it starts to store the primary zone information actually in the Active Directory database. Well, think about that. Those records then are automatically replicated to all the other domain controllers, and I have my DNS records everywhere. They're maintained, they're replicated around automatically and securely. So that's usually the way to go. There's some other things we'll talk about in just a few minutes. That's a primary zone. Now I can create DNS, I can create a secondary zone. This is really just a copy or a replica of a primary zone. Now normally I would do this to set those secondary records, or to put another copy of my DNS records out on another server somewhere in my domain, and it puts it closer to the clients or the applications that need those DNS records. But I have to be careful because this can create replication issues, because the more secondary zones I have out there, each one of these secondary zones have to contact the primary and get updates every time the primary is changed and so forth. So that can be an issue. You'll notice right here that anytime I set up a secondary zone, I have to give it the IP address of a primary zone computer so that it can know where to go get the records to make copies of. A primary is where we really keep the records. A secondary is a copy that's made and maintained from the primary. Then there's another type that's called a stub zone, and this really just serves as a pointer to other DNS servers. And this is the way to ensure in certain situations that if clients try to get information and they can't find it, we're just going to point them directly to another DNS server. Now there's something new that's in Server 2008 you will probably see something about on the exam. You don't have to dig into it very deeply, but just know what it is. Global Name Zone, or a GNZ. This goes back to the old WINS, because Microsoft names their computers single alpha names, or a NetBIOS name. A DNS name is what's called a fully qualified domain name, like vtc.com. Well, that's not just one word, so WINS can't handle that. So GNZ is used to replace WINS, and for example, in the vtc.class, well, class is our domain, VTC would be, I guess, the name of our computer, and so we could put just VTC in there. So anyway, this is just another attempt to try to get us away from WINS. Let's talk about integrated DNS. Be careful with this on the exam. When I integrate Active Directory, or when I integrate DNS into Active Directory, the primary zone is maintained as part of the Active Directory database, and that's the only one. Then the data is automatically replicated to all domain controllers. It more or less turns every domain controller into a source for DNS information, and it doesn't have to jump all over the network to get it. Now this also provides dynamic DNS updates. Just be aware of this on the exam. Now what does that mean? Well, since a computer itself has had to be authenticated to get on the Active Directory network, we know the computer's okay. Since the user that logged on, that brought that computer in, has been authenticated, we know everybody's safe and okay. So once the DHCP service gives that computer an IP address, we automatically enter that IP address and the fully qualified DNS name of that computer into our DNS records. And so our DNS records always stay updated as new computers come on and get updated with new IP addresses from DHCP. So as you can tell, there's a fair amount, and in the next video I'm going to go through with some standard DNS terms and just some quick explanations of what those are. But just go through a simple DNS installation. Just read a little bit about DNS and the various, just know about the different zones, primary, secondary, and stub, and you should be okay on the exam. You will get DNS questions, but if you just read up on DNS a little bit and just take the information I'm giving you here, you should be able to get past those.